Last week, we spent a lot of time discussing John Milton's Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost, as a literary work, really functions as a transitory piece between two great literary eras. The Renaissance, which is embodied by this delight in the world and the unlimited possibilities of exploration of the world, this kind of golden age of progress politically and culturally. 18th century, which is, or the age of reason and enlightenment. However, this week I really want to focus on the period of 1660 to 1700, or the Restoration period. And the Restoration is also a transitory period for England. After Oliver Cromwell's death and the dissolution of the Commonwealth, King Charles II, the son of King Charles I, in the restoration of the monarchy, really marks the new this new beginning, this new era, both in the life and the literature of England. So the restoration of Charles II brought about a revolutionary change to England. During the interregnum, or regum, Charles had spent most of his time in France in the court of Louis XIV. And he brings much of that French influence back with him, which we'll discuss further in a moment. But as a king, Charles II was happy to rule as a limited monarch. He understood what happened to his father, and for lack of a better phrase, he learned his lesson. And because he learned that lesson, he maintained a good relationship with Parliament. Politically, he passed several acts, most notably the Habeas Corpus Act in 1679, which guarantees the protection from arbitrary arrests and safeguards personal liberties. And he also unifies the Kingdom of England with Scotland, and under that we get the new flag, or the current English flag, which is the Union Jack. Anyways, his most notable claims to fame, or what's most important for our purposes, is about his time on the throne, is that Charles II reopens the theaters of London and undoes all of the Puritan past laws of moral behavior and censorship. And just as a note on an aside, after he reopens the theaters of London, women for the first time are able to perform on stage. So the tone of Charles II's reign is quite it's something to behold, really. He was inspired by his time in France, and he really emulates the decadence and sophistication and splendor of the French court. During his time on the throne, the gravity, moral earnestness, and decorum distinguished by the Puritan-driven Commonwealth are thrown completely to the wind. Guys, Charles II is a party animal. This is a time of wild and crazy debauchery socially. I mean, think about what happens when people are suppressed. You know, those Amish kids, for example, when they go on Rumsprika, or when they turn 18 and they go out into the world and decide if they want to be Amish or not, or somebody like, preachers' kids who have been suppressed, for lack of a better word, their entire lives. What happens when they finally get that freedom? Well, they go nuts, and the English people are no different. The natural instincts and desire for pleasure becomes excessive during this time. The king himself had a number of mistresses and misters. He was not indiscriminate by any means. Numerous illegitimate children, and he was surrounded by corrupt ministers, and really this idea of corruption, both morally, more morally than socially or politically, but this corruption was rampant in all walks of life. There's this real emphasis on decadence, sexual freedom, hedonism, and the libertarian life. The beginning of the Restoration was marked by this cheerfulness, gaiety, of licentiousness and moral laxity, and these tendencies of the age are very much present in the literature, which we'll see when we get to the second Earl of Rochester. Not only is this a flourishing time of the arts, there's also rapid development of science. I mean, this is the age of Sir Isaac Newton. Charles II establishes the Royal Society of London, and this interest in science and the discovery of the scientific method results in the beginning of rational inquiry and scientific objective rational outlooks. And this objectivity and rationality and intellectualism pave the way for the Enlightenment era, like with authors like John Locke. But this scientific discovery and exploration also affected religious attitudes alongside natural history, or the collection and description of facts of nature, and natural philosophy, the study and causes of what happens in nature. Thinkers of the period placed natural religion in the grand in their thought processes, and this is the study of the nature of books written by God. So these newly discovered natural laws, such as Newton's laws of optics and celestial mechanics, seemed evidence of a universal order in creation, which implied God's hand in design of the universe, as a watch implies a watchmaker. So basically what happens is this watchmaker theory, where God built this complex universe and then let it run by itself. And this expanded knowledge of peoples around the world who had never heard of Christianity led theologians to embrace deism. And this is the idea that religion need not depend on mystery or biblical truths and could rely on reason alone, which recognized the goodness and wisdom of natural law and creator. And we'll see this in more when we get to the 18th century stuff. But while Charles, these are some of the changes that happen religiously speaking during Charles's reign. But while Charles's reign is one of cultural and literary scientific success, it also sees its fair shares of disasters, including an outbreak of the plague in 1655 that kills 20% of London's population, and the Great Fire of London the following year. I mean, you think about, these poor people in 1665 and the outbreak of the plague. I'm sure they were thinking 1666 can't get any worse. Well, it does. It does indeed. So in 1666, there's this uncontrolled fire that lasted 3 days. And there's an excerpt in your book by Samuel Pepys that writes about this experience. It's fascinating firsthand account. And part of our Dryden literature focuses this week on the Great Fire of London, which we'll see, but I digress. During this fire, 1/5 of London is left standing. All of the civic buildings had been destroyed, and while amazingly only 6 people died, hundreds and thousands were left homeless. And although the Great Fire was a catastrophe, for lack of a better word, many people saw it as a punishment from God for their king's hedonist lifestyle. The fire also cleansed the city from the plague, and the overcrowded, disease-ridden streets of London were destroyed, and a new city is built by Christopher Wren. Also added to Charles II's troubles was the fact that despite his profligacy and sexual escapades, he failed to produce a legitimate heir. So his brother, James II, becomes king in 1685. And guys, we're right back where we started from 20 years ago with James's father, Charles I. And unlike Charles II, who learned from his father's ordeal, if you want to hang on to your throne and your head, you kind of want to play nice with Parliament. But James II, like his father and grandfather before him, sought to make himself an absolute monarch. Also, adding to his unpopularity was the fact that he was openly Catholic and he began to fill prominent positions of power with fellow Catholics. So, when his son, James II's son, was born in 1688, people were terrified at the prospect of a Catholic dynasty and the restoration of Catholicism in England. In an effort to usurp James II's power, Parliament withdraws their support from James and begins secretly negotiating with his Protestant daughter Mary, asking if she would mount an army and, if necessary, fight her father for the throne. So she agrees, but only under the stipulation that she could rule with her husband, the Dutchman and Protestant champion William of Orange. Parliament agrees, and so William comes into England, marches to London, and is met with very little resistance from his father in law, who flees to France. And so the glorious, bloodless revolution was over before it even got started. So, uh, so begins the reign of William and Mary, which is why we have the College of William and Mary here in Williamsburg that houses the Christopher Wren building, believe it or not. So, just an interesting aside, this is also the glorious bloodless revolution is also where we get the lullaby Rockabye Baby from. And so, anywho's, as a result of the Glorious Revolution, we get the Toleration Act of 1689, which provides toleration for non-Anglican Protestants, although ironically there are no rights and privileges to Catholics through this Toleration Act, and the Glorious Resolution or Revolution Settlement, which banned Catholics from sitting on the throne of England. And through this revolution, it also inspires political thought in the late 17th and 18th century through the writings of people like John Locke, the philosophies of French Enlightenment, and ultimately leads to things like the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Some literary principles that we are going to focus on this week, where I've broken it up into kind of three major authors of the period, but the literary principles that we are going to focus on are the Age of Hedonism, the Age of Reason, and Enlightenment, where we have this neoclassicism or a return to the greats, and the beginning of the Age of Satire. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up with kind of our background for the authors that we'll study this week and into the literature that we're going to discuss.